I used to believe that betrayal begins with desire, but now I know it begins with loneliness, the kind of loneliness that creeps into your bones when you sit beside a hospital bed at 3 in the morning listening to machines breathe for the man who once promised to breathe for you. The hospital room was always too cold and too quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor that reminded me that my husband Daniel was still alive even if he no longer looked like the man I married because illness had stolen the color from his skin, the strength from his hands, and the laughter from his lips. 3 weeks earlier we were arguing about something stupid like what color to paint the kitchen, and now I would have given anything just to hear him complain again about my terrible taste in decor. The doctors called it a severe autoimmune collapse, complicated, aggressive, unpredictable, and every time they said unpredictable my heart tightened because unpredictable meant they did not know if he would survive. Dr. Adrian Hale was the one leading his case, and from the very first day he carried himself with a calm authority that made the nurses move faster and the interns listen closer, and when he spoke to me he lowered his voice as if protecting me from the weight of the truth. He explained treatments, risks, possibilities, chances, percentages, but none of it mattered because all I heard was uncertainty, and uncertainty is more terrifying than bad news. I stopped sleeping properly after the first week. I stopped eating real meals. I stopped answering messages from friends because their normal lives felt offensive compared to the nightmare I was living. The only routine I had left was sitting beside Daniel, holding his motionless hand, whispering stories about our life together as if my voice could guide him back from wherever he was drifting. Sometimes I imagined he could hear me and that thought kept me sane. Sometimes I imagined he could not and that thought destroyed me. Dr. Hale began checking on me as much as he checked on Daniel, and at first it felt professional, responsible, kind, but slowly it started to feel personal. He would bring coffee without asking. He would remind me to drink water. He would tell me when to step outside for air. One night when Daniel's blood pressure suddenly dropped, the room filled with nurses and alarms and urgent voices, and I was pushed gently into the hallway while they worked on him, and I stood there frozen, staring at the closed door, convinced that if it opened with silence instead of sound my entire world would end. Minutes felt like hours, and when Dr. Hale finally stepped out, removing his gloves, his face was serious but steady, and he told me they had stabilized him for now. For now. Those 2 words became my prison. I tried to thank him, but instead I started crying uncontrollably, not graceful tears but broken, shaking sobs that made it hard to breathe, and I hated myself for falling apart in front of him. He did not look away. He did not rush me. He stepped closer and held my shoulders firmly as if anchoring me to the ground. "You are stronger than you think," he said quietly. But I did not feel strong. I felt empty and terrified and unbearably alone. That was the first time I noticed how close we were standing, how his hand remained on my shoulder a second longer than necessary, how his eyes searched mine, not like a doctor evaluating a situation but like a man seeing a woman in pain. And in that fragile, dangerous moment I felt seen. Not as a patient's wife. Not as a responsibility. Not as someone waiting for updates. But as a woman breaking under pressure. The days blurred after that, and every crisis seemed to pull us closer together because shared fear creates strange bonds, and in the middle of hospital chaos he became my only source of stability. He understood the medical language. He understood the risks. He understood my fear. And slowly he began to understand me. We started talking beyond updates about Daniel's condition. We talked about exhaustion, about sacrifice, about the emotional cost of loving someone who might slip away. He told me about losing his father years ago in a similar hospital room, and for the first time I saw vulnerability behind his controlled exterior. That vulnerability made him human. That humanity made him dangerous. One evening after another long procedure he found me sitting alone in the waiting area, staring at nothing, and without saying a word he sat beside me, close enough that our arms touched. The contact was subtle, accidental perhaps, but neither of us moved away. I should have. I knew I should have. My husband was still fighting inside that room. But loneliness whispers lies that sound like comfort. It tells you that you deserve warmth. It tells you that you deserve relief. It tells you that surviving the moment matters more than consequences. When he placed his hand over mine this time, it was not just grounding. It lingered, and I let it, because in that second I needed to feel something other than fear. I needed to feel alive. And guilt came later, much later. That night when I drove home to shower and change, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me because she looked exhausted, fragile, desperate, and somewhere deep in her eyes was a flicker of something forbidden. At the hospital the next morning, Daniel looked weaker and the machines sounded louder and reality felt closer to breaking. Dr. Hale stood beside me reviewing charts, and when our hands brushed again neither of us apologized. The air between us had shifted. There was tension now, not spoken, not acknowledged but present. A silent understanding that something was forming in the cracks of tragedy. I told myself it was emotional dependence. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it meant nothing. But denial does not erase truth. It only delays it, and as Daniel's condition grew more critical, my reliance on the only person who seemed steady grew stronger. I began waiting for his footsteps in the corridor. I began searching for his face in every room. I began feeling relief when he entered. Relief that had nothing to do with medical updates. The night everything changed started like every other night, with dim lights, humming machines, and the smell of antiseptic filling my lungs. Daniel had not regained consciousness, and the doctors warned that complications were increasing and the possibility of permanent damage was real. Permanent. That word echoed inside me like a warning bell. After midnight the hospital quieted and I found myself alone in the small family consultation room, trying to breathe through another wave of panic. He came in quietly, closing the door behind him, and for a moment neither of us spoke because silence felt safer than truth. Then he stepped closer. Too close. And I did not step back. His voice was low when he said, "You cannot carry this alone." And I whispered, "I already am." The distance between us disappeared slowly, not like a spark but like gravity pulling two exhausted souls toward the only warmth available. When he touched my face it was gentle, hesitant, giving me time to stop him. I did not. Because I was drowning. And he felt like air. The guilt existed even in that moment, but it was quieter than my fear, quieter than my loneliness, quieter than the desperate need to escape the reality of losing my husband. And when our foreheads rested together I knew a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Not because of passion, but because of weakness. And weakness can destroy everything. The moment his forehead rested against mine I felt the last fragile piece of who I used to be begin to crack, because I knew this was no longer just exhaustion, no longer just shared grief, no longer just comfort in a sterile hospital corridor. This was something darker, something selfish, something that would follow me long after the machines stopped beeping. I should have stepped away. I should have remembered the vows I made in a white dress under soft golden lights, promising loyalty in sickness and in health. But vows feel distant when sickness becomes real and health feels like a memory from another lifetime. When his hand slowly slid down from my face to my shoulders I felt heat rush through a body that had been numb for weeks, and that warmth felt wrong and right at the same time, like standing too close to a fire when you have been freezing for days. We did not speak about Daniel in that moment because saying his name would have shattered whatever fragile illusion we were creating in that dim consultation room. Instead there was silence, thick heavy breathing, and the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears, reminding me that I was still alive even if my husband might not survive. He hesitated one last time, giving me space to stop him, to walk out, to choose differently, and that pause was my final chance to remain the woman I once believed I was. I did not take it. Because grief had twisted my logic and loneliness had rewritten my morality and fear had convinced me that surviving emotionally mattered more than staying faithful. When he kissed me it was not wild or rushed, it was slow, careful, almost questioning, as if asking, "Are you sure?" and my response was not words but surrender. In that single irreversible second I crossed a line that no apology could erase. Afterward the room felt smaller, the air heavier, reality sharper, and I pulled away first because guilt arrives like cold water once the heat fades. We did not look at each other for several seconds, and I could feel the weight of what we had done settling into the silence between us. My husband was still fighting for his life down the hallway. And I had just betrayed him with the man sworn to save him. The cruelty of that truth pressed against my chest so hard I thought I might collapse. "This cannot happen again," he said quietly, his voice no longer steady, no longer purely professional. But even as he said it neither of us sounded convinced. Because something had already shifted too far. When I returned to Daniel's bedside I could not meet his closed eyes, because even though he was unconscious I felt watched, judged, exposed. I held his hand and whispered, "I am here," like I had every night before, but this time the words tasted like lies. Days passed, and instead of distancing ourselves the tension only grew stronger, because forbidden connections feed on secrecy, and every glance across the corridor, every accidental touch, every shared breath in small rooms intensified the gravity pulling us together. We tried to behave normally during rounds, we kept our voices neutral, our expressions controlled, but beneath that professionalism lived a dangerous awareness that only we understood. And the hospital became a maze of temptation. One afternoon Daniel briefly regained partial consciousness, his eyes fluttering open, unfocused, confused, and I felt hope explode inside me so violently that I almost forgot everything else. I leaned close, telling him I was here, that he was safe, that he needed to keep fighting, and for a moment his fingers weakly tightened around mine. That tiny movement should have been enough to snap me back completely. It should have reminded me of who I belonged to. But hope is complicated when guilt already lives in your heart. Later that evening complications returned and his condition worsened again and the fragile optimism collapsed into another spiral of uncertainty. I found myself in Dr. Hale's office again. Seeking updates but truly seeking him. He looked exhausted, torn, conflicted, and when the door closed behind me the silence felt charged. "This has to stop," he said again, running a hand through his hair as if trying to erase the last few days. But stopping would mean facing everything alone again. Stopping would mean feeling the full weight of fear without comfort. Stopping would mean choosing morality over survival. And I was not strong enough. So instead of stepping back I stepped forward. And that choice turned an emotional betrayal into something physical, undeniable and impossible to justify. It did not happen in a rush of passion, it happened in quiet desperation, in stolen moments between medical updates, in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Each time I told myself it was the last. Each time I told myself once Daniel stabilizes this will end. But Daniel did not stabilize. He declined. Slowly, painfully, unpredictably. And with every setback my attachment to the one person who seemed in control deepened. Rumors began subtly, nurses exchanging glances, a longer than necessary door closing, whispers that stopped when I entered rooms because hospitals may be sterile but they are never blind. I noticed the shift in how some staff looked at me, not openly accusing but quietly observing. And fear changed shape inside me, no longer just fear of losing my husband but fear of being discovered. The breaking point came the night Daniel went into cardiac distress and the room exploded into chaos again, alarms shouting, footsteps rushing, hands moving quickly over his fragile body. I stood frozen against the wall, watching as the man I married hovered between life and death, and suddenly everything I had done felt monstrous. While he fought for air I had been stealing moments of comfort in hidden rooms. While he clung to survival I had surrendered to weakness. When the doctors finally stabilized him again I collapsed into a chair, shaking uncontrollably, and Dr. Hale avoided my eyes for the first time since this began. Because in that room filled with medical urgency reality had screamed louder than desire. "This cannot continue," he said firmly later, his voice heavy not with temptation but with consequence. "You are his wife and I am his doctor, and this is destroying everything." And for the first time I saw fear in him, not fear of losing control but fear of losing his career, his reputation, his integrity. Everything we had risked suddenly felt real. The walls felt thinner, the whispers louder, the guilt unbearable. But even standing at the edge of exposure, even staring at the damage we were causing, a part of me still clung to him, because losing Daniel and losing this forbidden connection at the same time felt like falling into complete darkness. I realized then that betrayal is not a single act, it is a series of choices, each one easier than the last, until you no longer recognize yourself. And I no longer recognized the woman sitting in that hospital room pretending to be loyal while hiding a secret powerful enough to shatter lives. Daniel's condition reached a critical turning point 2 days later, and the doctors called me in for a serious discussion about possible outcomes, long-term impact, survival chances. Survival chances. The phrase echoed like a verdict. As they spoke I felt detached, floating above my own body, watching the consequences of my actions unfold in a life that no longer felt stable. Because if Daniel survived I would have to live with what I had done. And if he did not survive I would have to live with what I had done. Either way there was no escape. And somewhere deep inside I understood that the real storm had not yet begun. There is a moment before everything collapses, when the world becomes unbearably quiet, as if life itself is holding its breath, waiting to see which direction your fate will fall. And I remember standing in that silence outside the intensive care unit, knowing that whatever happened next would define the rest of my life. Daniel's condition had reached a fragile turning point, neither improving nor completely failing, suspended in a space doctors call guarded, but what it really means is we do not know. And uncertainty is a crueler punishment than certainty, because it forces you to sit inside your own consequences with no distraction. Dr. Hale had begun distancing himself professionally, emotionally, physically, because the reality of what we had done now felt heavier than the comfort it once gave us, and every avoided glance, every clipped sentence, every extra nurse present during updates reminded me that secrecy never stays silent forever. The whispers in the corridors were no longer subtle, and I could feel judgment in the air like humidity before a storm. I started noticing how often doors remained slightly open when we were inside rooms, how nurses volunteered to stay during consultations, how administrative staff suddenly appeared near offices where we once met alone. Suspicion does not need proof to exist, it only needs patterns. And we had created too many. One afternoon Daniel opened his eyes fully for the first time in weeks, not confused, not drifting, but present, aware, fragile but conscious, and when his gaze found mine something inside me shattered, because I saw recognition. I saw memory. I saw trust. His voice was weak, barely audible, but he whispered my name and I leaned close, holding his hand as tears streamed down my face, not only from relief but from the unbearable weight of guilt pressing against my chest. In that moment I realized something devastating. He had been fighting this entire time. Fighting through pain, through darkness, through uncertainty. While I had been surrendering. Surrendering to fear. Surrendering to loneliness. Surrendering to someone else. He asked if I had been there with him and I said yes, because technically I had, but the truth felt poisoned because being physically present is not the same as being faithful. The days that followed were filled with cautious improvement, slow, fragile progress, like someone learning to walk again after falling from a great height, and hope returned cautiously to the room. But hope does not erase betrayal. It only magnifies it. Every time Dr. Hale entered the room to examine Daniel, the tension was suffocating, because now my husband's eyes were open, now he could see, now he could sense. And intuition is powerful in marriage. One evening after a long evaluation, Daniel looked between us and asked quietly, "Have you two known each other long?" The question was simple, neutral, almost casual, but it felt like an accusation. My heart stopped. Dr. Hale responded professionally, explaining timelines, procedures, medical context, but I could feel Daniel watching, not just listening. He was weak but not blind. That night when visiting hours ended, Daniel asked me to stay a little longer and his fingers tightened around mine with surprising strength. "You look tired," he whispered. Not just physically. His eyes searched mine as if trying to read something beneath the surface. Guilt has a smell. It changes how you breathe, how you answer, how you hold someone's gaze. And I realized I was no longer convincing. 2 days later everything exploded, not in a dramatic public confrontation but in a quiet, devastating truth. A nurse had reported concerns to hospital administration about boundary issues, about closed doors, about prolonged consultations unrelated to treatment, and while there was no undeniable proof, suspicion was enough to launch an internal review. Dr. Hale was temporarily reassigned pending investigation. The news hit like a bomb. Not because I feared scandal first, but because I saw what my weakness had cost. His career, his reputation, his years of discipline and integrity. All placed at risk because we both sought comfort in the wrong place. When Daniel heard about the reassignment, confusion turned into realization with terrifying speed, because betrayal often reveals itself not through evidence but through change. He looked at me differently that evening, not with anger at first but with something worse. Distance. I tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to deny, but words collapsed under the weight of truth, and eventually silence confessed what I could not. "Did something happen?" he asked softly, and that softness destroyed me more than shouting ever could. Because anger can be fought. But disappointment cannot. Tears blurred my vision as I struggled between protecting myself and finally being honest, and in the end guilt chose for me. Yes. The word left my mouth like a death sentence. His hand slowly slipped from mine, not dramatically, not violently, just a quiet withdrawal of trust, and in that motion I felt the full destruction of my choices. He did not scream. He did not curse. He turned his face toward the window. And that hurt more than anything. I tried to justify my weakness by explaining fear, by explaining loneliness, by explaining how I thought I was losing him, but excuses sound hollow when spoken to someone who never stopped fighting to stay alive. "I was still here," he whispered without looking at me. That sentence will echo inside me for the rest of my life. Because he was right. He had been here, struggling, breathing, enduring, and instead of standing unshaken beside him, I had fractured. The hospital completed its review weeks later. There was no public scandal, no dramatic firing, but Dr. Hale chose to resign quietly, transferring to another city, another hospital, another life. We never spoke again. Not closure, not apology, not longing. Because some chapters end not with fireworks but with consequences. Daniel recovered slowly, physically stronger each week, but emotionally something permanent had shifted between us, like a crack in glass that never fully disappears even after repair. We entered therapy. We tried conversations. We tried rebuilding. But betrayal changes the temperature of love. It introduces doubt into spaces that once felt safe. And every time his eyes lingered on mine, I wondered if he was remembering that moment when I chose weakness over loyalty. Months later, when he finally returned home from the hospital, the house felt both familiar and foreign, because survival does not guarantee restoration. We sit at the same kitchen table now, sometimes in silence, sometimes in cautious conversation, both aware that healing from illness was easier than healing from betrayal. People think cheating is about passion or excitement, but they do not understand that sometimes it is born from fear, from desperation, from emotional collapse. That does not excuse it. It explains it, and explanation is not redemption. If I could return to that cold hospital corridor, if I could stand again in that moment when comfort first brushed against temptation, I would choose differently. Not because I was caught. Not because there were consequences. But because in trying to survive my husband's possible death I nearly destroyed our marriage while he was still alive. And that is a truth heavier than any punishment. This is not a story about romance. It is a story about weakness. About how grief can distort judgment. About how loneliness can whisper lies louder than vows. And about how some mistakes do not end when the affair ends. They live quietly in the spaces between two people who are trying to love each other again. The machines eventually stopped beeping. The hospital rooms emptied. Life moved forward. But every time I hear the faint echo of a monitor in a television show or smell antiseptic in a clinic, I am reminded of the night I chose comfort over loyalty and how close I came to losing everything. Not because my husband died, but because he survived, and had to learn who I had become while he was fighting to stay alive.